Hi everyone, I just want to share the build I played to level 136 challenges in the Expedition League, which is a staff-based Vengeance Gladiator centered around the Martyr of Innocence unique. This isn't so much a build guide as it is a showcase of what I've been up to, especially since Scourge League is coming soon and will include many balance changes. Given how many things are changing, a lot of what I'm going to show here, especially the defenses, won't be very relevant in a couple of weeks. Therefore, let this video serve as a monument to the pains I endured in the Expedition era of player defenses. If there's any interest, I can make a separate video later about how you might attempt a similar build next league. This isn't a terribly imaginative build, as a lot of it directly follows from building around Martyr of Innocence. Beyond the basic build-enabling pieces, there's nothing particularly gimmicky about this character. This also isn't a build with a very high ceiling for DPS. Even with very optimized gear, DPS is around 2.5 million under ideal conditions. However, it's a very safe build, as I've played it to level 100, just soloing a wide variety of Atlas and Atlas-adjacent content. This build deals the majority of its damage with Vengeance, a counterattack skill that has a chance to be triggered whenever I'm hit. Vengeance can come from a skill gem, but it's also granted directly by Martyr of Innocence. Support gems socketed into the staff will support Vengeance regardless of links. As you can see, my staff is not fully linked, but my Vengeance shows 6 support gems, making it effectively a 7-link. For Vengeance to be a reliable way to deal damage, I can't rely on being hit by enemies. Instead, I need a way to hit myself frequently. Eye of Innocence causes me to take fire damage whenever I ignite an enemy. This, combined with a fast attack skill like Cyclone, will ensure I'm being hit frequently enough to proc Vengeance reliably. Martyr of Innocence and Eye of Innocence are clearly designed to be used together, and both of them grant powerful bonuses if I'm ignited. Since I'm frequently being hit by Eye of Innocence's self-damaging effect, I can ensure I'm constantly ignited by using Moko's Embrace, which gives incoming fire damage a 25% chance to ignite me. While ignited, I get 70% increased damage and 2% fire damage leech from the amulet, and chill and freeze immunity from the staff. I also use a hot-headed jewel, which gives me movement and attack speed while ignited. Since my main skill is granted by my weapon, I can put a 6-link Cyclone in my body armor. All of the support gems linked to Cyclone are for utility. Life gain on hit restores life, Combustion raises ignite chance and debuffs fire resistance, Power Charge on critical generates power charges, Culling Strike executes enemies, and Blind makes me evade every other attack. Support gems for Vengeance are all for damage. The most noteworthy of these is Divergent Pulverize, which has a steeper penalty to attack speed than regular Pulverize, but a much higher damage multiplier. Since Vengeance is a triggered skill, the attack speed penalty is inconsequential. Thus, this one support gem is giving Vengeance 72% more damage and 34% increased AoE. Other support gems include Increased Critical Strikes, Elemental Focus, Immolate, Elemental Damage with Attacks, and Fire Penetration. I also have Vol Ancestral Warchief and Leap Slam linked to faster attacks and Life Tap, Level 1 Wave of Conviction linked to Level 1 Cast when damage taken, and Immortal Call linked to increased duration. For reservations, I use Precision, Purity of Elements, Blood and Sand, and Aspect of the Crab. I get a total of 66% increased cooldown recovery rate for Vengeance, 30% from a Helm enchantment, 20% from my boots, and 16% from my belt. Because Vengeance is a triggered skill, its DPS scales linearly with cooldown recovery rate. 66% increased cooldown recovery rate corresponds to roughly 66% more damage for Vengeance. The increased cooldown rate lowers Vengeance's cooldown from 1.2 seconds to 0.73 seconds. I use a ring that triggers Assassin's Mark, which gives crit chance and multiplier against rares and uniques. Without flasks up, Vengeance has a near 100% chance to crit bosses and around 500% crit multiplier. While active, Bottled Faith caps crit at 100% and also applies a debuff to damage taken. Since this build doesn't use many increased damage taken debuffs, this one from Bottled Faith is pretty significant. The only other increased damage taken debuff I have is from Intimidate, which I'm getting through a Lethal Pride Jewel. The other flask I use for DPS is the Wise Oak, for which I've balanced my 3 elemental resistances to gain its full benefit. The Gladiator Ascendancy is virtually mandatory for Vengeance builds, as the Painforge node makes counterattack skills deal double damage. One other noteworthy offensive choice is anointing the Charging Offensive notable, which makes me generate Frenzy Charges while using Cyclone. This build gets 20% more movement speed from Challenger charges granted by the Arena Challenger Ascendancy notable. It also gets 35% increased movement speed from Boots and 18% from Hot-Headed. The Rotgut Unique Flask, in addition to the 40% movement speed from being a Quicksilver Flask, also grants Onslaught for up to 9 seconds on use, depending on the number of Frenzy Charges consumed. Rotgut gains charges on Critical Strike, and Frenzy Charge generation is reliable with Charging Offensive, so Rotgut can be used liberally for Onslaught. This character has pretty solid AoE. In addition to the Pulverize gem, this build gets a significant amount of increased AoE from Cluster Jewels. I use 2 medium clusters with Towering Threat and Titanic Swings, which boost AoE for both Cyclone and Vengeance. Most of my fun optimizing this character came from min-maxing its defensive options. To explain those, let's go down the list of defenses in the order in which the game actually applies them. First are Evasion and Dodge. This character has virtually no evasion rating, but the blind debuff applied by Cyclone means I have 50% chance to evade anyway. I also have 5% attack and spell dodge from Soul of Lunaris. Next we have damage taken as modifiers. I have 10% of physical damage taken as fire from my helmet. I also got really lucky divining this lethal Pride Jewel, which gives me 15% of physical damage taken as fire, in addition to the Intimidate debuff I mentioned earlier. Altogether, 25% of physical damage is taken as fire, allowing it to be mitigated more easily and making armor more effective at mitigating the remaining physical damage. Then, I get 20% physical damage reduction from 5 endurance charges, which are generated very quickly with Cyclone thanks to the Charging Offensive and Smashing Strikes notables. I also get up to 30% additional physical damage reduction from Aspect of the Crab, which is very effective on builds like this which take physical damage very infrequently. I then get a variable amount of physical damage reduction from my armor, which varies between 7900 and 9300 depending on whether I've blocked recently. Soul of Lunaris provides up to 8% additional physical damage reduction based on the number of nearby enemies, which is good for tougher packs, such as Expeditions and Simulacra. For resistances, I have 76% fire resistance, 75% cold and lightning resistances, and 45% chaos resistance. Next are damage taken modifiers. I have 6% reduced elemental damage taken from Wise Oak, and 20% less damage taken from hits from Fortify, which is given by the Overlord Cluster Jewel notable. In playing this character, I've also discovered that guard skills can be very handy if used reactively instead of being triggered or bound to left-click. With 5 endurance charges, Divergent Immortal Call provides 77% less physical damage taken and 40% less elemental damage taken, for nearly 3 seconds on demand. I've been using Immortal Call to tank things that otherwise might have been dangerous, such as Expedition packs, Fall Detonate Dead, and many boss abilities like the Shaper's Slam. After all that comes Block Chance. It's very easy to cap Block Chance on this character. With only Martyr of Innocence, the passive skill tree, and Ascendancy passives, this build has attack and spell block that vary between 74% and 78% while in combat. Any damage that makes it through the block layer is removed from my life pool, as I have no defenses that redirect the damage to other resources. This character has only 6600 life, but that's plenty given all the other defensive layers. Given how infrequently this build takes damage from enemy hits, and given its relatively high mobility for a melee build, one might think it's a great candidate for Ward, the defensive mechanic introduced in Expedition League. However, Ward doesn't work here because I'm constantly damaging myself with Eye of Innocence. Eye of Innocence doesn't interfere with Aspect of the Crab because it doesn't deal physical damage, but Ward is agnostic to damage type and doesn't work with Eye of Innocence. As an additional layer of active defense, I use the Verana's Preparation unique Iron Flask, which makes me debilitate nearby enemies for 2 seconds when its effect ends. With this build, the flask effect basically ends immediately, thanks to the self-damage from Eye of Innocence. The Debilitate debuff makes enemies deal 10% less damage and slows their movement speed. I've used Instilling Orbs to make the flask activate automatically whenever I use a guard skill, effectively making my Immortal Call even more effective as an oh shit button. A lot of care has been taken to make this character immune or otherwise resistant to as many things as I could squeeze in. We now know that immunities will be far easier to get in the next league, but hopefully you can appreciate this for what it is in the current league. Martyr of Innocence gives immunity to freeze and chill while ignited. I have 100% chance to avoid shock thanks to my boots, this Abyss Jewel, and 2 Jewel Implicits. I also have 100% chance to avoid stun from the same Abyss Jewel, Jewel Implicits, and 2 crafted suffixes. Kraken's Carapace grants bleeding immunity, and this Jewel Corruption grants corrupted blood immunity. I'm using a corrupted Moko's Embrace that gives poison immunity. Thanks to Sanctum of Thought, Soul of Yugal, and this ring, curses have 75% reduced effect on me. That becomes 105% when I use my Bottled Faith, thanks to this belt enchantment. Last, but certainly not least, I have immunity to crit damage. Sanctum of Thought gives 20% reduced extra damage taken from critical strikes. I get an additional 30% from my belt, and the last 50% from an implicit on my Kraken's Carapace. The body armor corruption was very intentional and took a lot of money and patience. It was not necessary at all, but I had nothing else to spend my currency on as I finished my end-of-league goals. Even 50% reduced extra crit damage was pretty huge, as one-shots are among the only things that could kill this character. In my opinion, this defensive stat is pretty undervalued by the PoE community in general. Now that they're adding a shield affix for it in patch 3.16, maybe we'll see that perception change in the next league. The defenses of this character have made expedition encounters extraordinarily safe. The only remnants I avoid are fire damage immunity, crit immunity, and elemental ailment immunity. However, because this build uses one attack to trigger another, I find the remnants that give monsters block and dodge especially annoying. To combat this, I have 2 block chance reduction support gems that I swap into Vengeance and Cyclone for some logbook encounters. Next League, I'm sure that hitting these immunity thresholds will require far less investment, allowing more investment to go into offense. While we're on the topic of Next League, I want to talk for a moment about Purity of Elements. I'm one of the few people who actually like using Purity of Elements, even in its current state. I've used it in a handful of recent builds, partly to free up suffixes, but mainly because I really like its Watcher's Eye mods. I think Purity of Elements will be much more widely used in the Next League. However, ironically, the ailment immunity buff it's receiving will make it unusable for this build, as it relies on being ignited. Let's briefly go over what I could have done better, or just differently. Basically, all of the things that can still kill this character are elemental. In particular, Detonate Dead and Tormented Martyrs are pretty scary, and certain endgame bosses hit really hard with elemental spells. I'm also susceptible to big ignites, such as those inflicted by the Enslaver, certain incursion monsters, and monsters in some expedition encounters. If I'm not quick with my Immortal Call, elemental threats can do a lot of damage quickly. Consequently, the single best thing I could do to improve my survivability further is to use Divine Flesh. This would involve using Glorious Vanity instead of Lethal Pride, getting more Chaos Resistance, and maybe getting some maximum Chaos Resistance from small cluster jewels. I considered the offensive opportunity cost of this too high on a build whose damage is already nothing to write home about. I could also try to become unaffected by Ignite. Ignite immunity is out of the question, since the build relies on being ignited to function properly. However, being unaffected by Ignite would allow me to still be ignited, but not take any damage from Ignite. This could be achieved through an elevated prefix on my boots, but getting that alongside life and movement speed would have been so expensive that I didn't consider it worth it. I'm sure that if I had chosen to play this build next league instead of this league, I could have found it easier to squeeze in that mod. As for offensive optimizations, there's nothing major, but there's a handful of very small things that could add up to a noticeable damage increase. A lot of these optimizations involve jewels. For example, I could get 2 more shock avoidance implicits on jewels and replace my Abyss jewel with this one, which gives crit multiplier instead of shock avoidance. I could also get a Lethal Pride jewel that gives more offensive bonuses, such as melee crit multiplier instead of physical damage taken as fire. If I wanted to, I could spend a ton of money on triple crit multiplier jewels, but that would require other adjustments as I'm using spare jewel suffixes to fill in resists and attributes. One thing that would be great to squeeze in is a Warlord suffix on my helmet, giving enemies minus 9% fire resistance. However, one thing that makes gearing this character difficult is that it suffers from what I like to call suffix pressure. It needs specific suffixes in specific places, such as stun avoidance on the helmet and gloves, Assassin's Mark and curse reduction on a ring, cooldown rate on the belt and boots, and flat accuracy in 2 of the 3 possible gear slots for it. It also uses several unique items and doesn't use a shield. Consequently, capping resists is a challenge, and sacrificing suffixes for damage is even harder. That's why I use Purity of Elements and the corresponding Watcher's Eye with Chaos Resistance. They help relieve a lot of the suffix pressure and make it easier to fit everything in. Still, although the minus 9% fire resistance mod would be great to have, I can't easily fit it in without making a handful of other changes. Another possible optimization that's being held back by suffix pressure is getting Redeemer-influenced gloves with global chance to blind on hit. This would allow me to replace the blind support in Cyclone with rage support. Those are all of the optimizations that I consider feasible right now, aside from divining items or corrupting them for vol implicits. I've already gone through the ordeal of farming corruption altars for 1 gear slot, so I don't feel like doing it again. This has been one of the more fun builds to optimize. It's easy to get started on a low budget, especially since it doesn't require a 6-link to function. The sockets in the staff don't need to be linked, and even a 4-link Cyclone will suffice without impeding the build's basic functionality. In terms of how the build feels to play, well, it feels like Cyclone. If you've played Cyclone, or any build that uses Cyclone, such as Cast on Crit Cyclone or Cast while channeling Cyclone, you know how this build will feel to play. There is a sort of rhythm to the way this build deals damage, since it deals it in chunks every 0.8 seconds or so. However, for the most part, the build just feels like a Cyclone build, with okay damage and really good survivability. If you want to play a similar build in patch 3.16, I'm reasonably confident that the core mechanics of self-damaging and triggering vengeance won't change. What will change a lot is how you build defenses. If there's any interest, I can follow up on this uncertainty once the patch notes are posted and POB is updated. Thanks for watching.